clap for somebody before they speak. So we're going to be spending the whole day thinking about lots of really, really complicated things. But in fact, the most complicated thing that we spend time thinking about routinely is actually pretty old school. It's the mind of the thing that's sitting next to you right now. Now, philosophically, this is supposed to be a big problem for us. And the reason is that we don't actually have access to others' minds. I can't feel you thinking. I can't sense your attitude or belief. I can't see your want, or I can't see a feeling, right? This has been articulated centuries ago by the pre-Socratic philosopher Gorgias, who articulated that because we don't have access to the minds of others, philosophically speaking, we can't conclude that there's any mind that exists on this planet other than our own. Now, as with many philosophical problems, this one really seems to be more of a problem for philosophers than they do for real people. I doubt anybody in this room has lost any sleep wondering whether they're a brain in a vat or whether anybody else thinks or believes or has attitudes like we do ourselves. The philosophical version of the other mind's problem isn't really much of a problem at all. If it's a problem for us, it resembles more of an addiction than it does a conundrum. We spend all kinds of time thinking about each other's minds. We do this almost as easily as we breathe. This seems to be the kind of inference that our brains, in many ways, were equipped to do. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't real versions of the other mind's problem in real life. In fact, there are. The real problem that we have in thinking about the minds of other people is figuring out what the hell is on it. That is what is going on between the ears of other people. Is somebody actually thinking? Are they capable of feeling? Is this person suffering or not? Is this judgment something that people made with careful thought, or did they think rather mindlessly? Does this person like me or not, trust me or not? Other minds are a real problem in everyday life because they're inherently hard to understand. Now, what I want to suggest is that the real other mind's problem in daily life really boils down to two fundamental questions that we ask implicitly or explicitly about each other almost any time we're in an interaction with somebody. This isn't something we do arguably every day of our lives. This is something we do every 5 minutes of our lives, every time we meet somebody else. There are really two kind of fundamental questions here that we're interested in our research as social psychologists studying social cognition. One is this question: does this thing have a mind? Is this thing I'm interacting with capable of thinking or feeling? Does it have beliefs and wants, desires? Can it suffer or not? And this boils down to what I think are two broad areas of research that I think are interesting. One is a phenomena that we think of as anthropomorphism. These are cases where we attribute minds to things that might not have them, right? To computers or gadgets or pets or whatever, things where to non-human agents. Second phenomena is kind of the inverse of that, what we think of as dehumanization. These are cases where we're evaluating other people and we fail to attribute a mind to them. We think of them as relatively mindless, more like an animal or an object. The second fundamental question that social psychologists are interested in here, and the question that's of interest to us in everyday life, is once we've actually concluded that somebody can think, or they're capable of thinking, or they have a mind, the second question then is, what kind of mind is it? That is, what's on its mind? What's it thinking about? What are their specific beliefs, attitudes, preferences, emotions, and so on? Okay? What I want to think about today is how the medium through which we interact with each other, something that technology has enabled, an explosion in the ways we connect with or communicate with each other, what are the consequences of the medium through which we interact with each other for these kinds of inferences? And what I want to talk about, spend most of my time talking about, are these phenomena here, things that we think of as dehumanization. Now, typically when you hear that term described out in the world, we think of extreme cases of prejudice. But in fact, psychologists can very easily find much more subtle versions of this without much difficulty at all. Almost any time you get people in a state of conflict where people believe fundamentally different things or they're viewing the world in fundamentally different ways, the natural tendency in these kinds of conflicts is not to just recognize that somebody might think differently about a problem. The natural tendency, or one of the tendencies, is to question whether the other side is actually capable of thinking at all. One of the most common outcomes in any conflict is a sentiment that I'm okay, I'm a reasonable person, I'm viewing the world as it is, but you're biased. You're mistaken in some way. You're not quite as reasonable or rational or thoughtful or intelligent as I am. And you can see this when you look out in the world almost any day. This isn't something new to our political discourse right now, but it certainly seems to be especially common right now. When the left looks at the right and describes somebody as crazy, that's not just making a statement implicitly about what somebody believes. It's really making a statement about their capacity to think about something. It's a statement about their capacity of mind. And this happens not just when the right looks at the left, but of course when the left looks at the right as well. You see in these cases subtle examples of people questioning whether other people really have a mind like their own or not. And these are the kinds of phenomena that we think of as subtle forms of dehumanization. Now, again, the question is how different media of interaction or of communication with each other might affect these kinds of judgments. Now, as I mentioned, the philosophical version of the other minds problem doesn't seem to be much of a problem for us, but the general underlying sentiment is right. That is, it is true that there's only one mind on the planet that you have any conscious experience with, and that's your own, right? You know when you're thinking. You can feel it. You have experiences every day. You can know what it's like to feel shame or pride or guilt or embarrassment. You experience all of this stuff in your own mind, and so it feels like you got a lot going on in there. This is kind of the experience that people have of themselves. That's right. But for others, it's a much more challenging thing. We don't have direct access to the minds of others, and so we have to make inferences about what's going on between somebody else's ears based on the cues that we get from other people in interactions. Okay? And Georges was right that you can't see the mind of another person, but what I want to suggest to you today is that you can actually hear it. That is, that we might be able to recognize the presence of other minds through our ears, through other people's mouths. Okay? And that's what I want to suggest to you today. If we think about it, language is the tool that we evolved to communicate all of these hidden thoughts and beliefs and attitudes and experience and knowledge to other people. Think about what we're doing here today, right? Think about how hard it would be to communicate the content of my research through pantomime. Now, I'm pretty talented at that. You might be impressed. But I couldn't communicate nearly as much as what we're communicating right now. Language is the tool we use to communicate what's on our minds to others. And language comes not just with semantic content. It also comes with lots of cues in the voice. The closest you're ever going to get to somebody's ongoing conscious mental experience, I'll suggest, is through their voice when they're communicating what's on their mind to somebody else. What that suggests, what that predicts, is that in mediums of interaction or communication that have voice, that have the presence of a voice, people might seem more mindful, more thoughtful, more intelligent, more rational, more human-like than in mediums of communication or interaction that lack a voice. When you strip out a person's voice, do other people seem more mindless? Is text-based interaction subtly dehumanizing? Text-based interaction is obviously not a new thing. We've been able to write letters to each other for a very long time and communicate that way, but technology has made this an increasingly common way of interacting with each other. So let me describe a few experiments that we've conducted, Juliana and I have conducted over the years. This was a study in which we brought people into the lab, speakers, communicators, who had polarizing beliefs, beliefs on opposing sides of some contentious issue. And these were our stimuli for this study. So we had 6 participants explain their belief about a polarizing view, and then we had them evaluated by 309 people who had either the same belief, so they were on the same side, or they had an opposing belief. Obviously, the tendency to think of other people as relatively mindless happens more strongly when people are on the opposing side of an issue that you are. And so we surveyed people to find out what polarizing issues really were. That is, where do you see bimodal distributions in people's beliefs in these samples? And we found 3 beliefs, 3 attitudes or opinion statements that were particularly contentious in our sample. So the first was abortion rights. The second was support for the Iraq war at the time. Were you in favor of or opposed to it? And the last one was whether you preferred rap or country music. Very polarizing issue. Turns out equally polarizing as these other 2. What you then did is you reported your impression of the speaker across a number of different dimensions. I'll just show you our 2 most central dimensions here in just a moment. Reported your impressions of the speaker after watching, hearing, or reading the person explain his or her position. And what we did was we interviewed these speakers over video camera, and we then created multiple stimuli out of these. We can either get the audiovisual condition, so you can see the person and hear the person, just the audio where we take out the visual cues and you just hear the person, or we create a transcript of that so you just have the semantic content. So the semantic content is the same across these 3 conditions. And then we ask about a few different measures. The ones that we're most interested in are these measures of dehumanization. These come from Nick Haslam, who's a psychologist in Australia. And there are two fundamental dimensions here that we care about. One are traits that index what Haslam refers to as uniquely human traits. These are things like the speaker is refined, the speaker is rational and logical, the speaker is sophisticated. These are all implicitly judgments about the capacity of somebody's mind really to think, right? How analytical is the person. These human nature traits over here are more about emotional experience and feeling, the other core component of our minds. The speaker is emotional, the speaker is responsive, and the speaker is warm. And what do we see? Well, first, here are the three conditions: audiovisual, audio, or transcript. Again, the same semantic content. What we see is that people are judged to be sort of less human-like when you strip the voice out of the interaction. So text is seen as less, these people are rated as less uniquely human and having weaker human nature traits than those in the voice condition. Adding visual cues, being able to see the person, doesn't affect these judgments much above and beyond the voice alone. That's a pretty consistent effect we find over and over again. The voice really seems to be the thing we find that communicates the presence of mind in somebody else. These are cases of agreement. We don't see the same kind of effect when you agree with somebody else. Their medium doesn't seem to matter. There, I think people assume that the other person is just as smart and capable of feeling as they are. Of course, as all of you know, we went through a rather contentious election that we're all still recovering from. We conducted one study during the primaries where we had people evaluate others who either were explaining beliefs they agreed with or beliefs they disagreed with. So in this study, we had 8 people come in who were supporting different candidates who explained who they supported in the presidential election. They were evaluated by 614 people who either had favorable or unfavorable views of these particular candidates that we were supporting. We get the same kinds of measures that we had before. They rate their impressions of the speaker after watching, hearing, or reading the person explain his or her position. Now, in this study, we have 4 different medium conditions. We had them say why they're supporting this candidate, and we recorded this over videotape, and we can get 3 conditions out of that: audiovisual, audio, and a transcript of that, which is text. And they also wrote, they prepared a statement, they wrote a statement explaining why they supported this candidate as well. That's a good text condition. It's not exactly the same semantic content as the others, but it varies the medium. It strips the voice out of that. We get exactly the same effects in the AV and the audio conditions, the two conditions that contain voice, and in the 2 conditions that are only text. We see similar effects there. So we collapse across those here just for ease of presentation, and we see similar effects. That is, these are in cases of disagreement. You judge the person to be more human-like, more mindful when you hear what they have to say than when you read it, both in terms of human uniqueness and human nature, although the effects on thought are consistently bigger than the effects that are related to voice. In cases of agreement here, we see weaker effects, although, as you'll see in a moment, we sometimes get similar effects. Person seems slightly more mindful when you hear what they have to say than when you read it, but it's weaker there in cases of agreement. We also ran a study on the eve of the presidential election where we had people supporting Trump or Clinton explain why they were voting for this particular candidate. Again, the same conditions as before. And this was on the weekend before the Tuesday election, and we get the same kinds of results. You can see in the disagreement condition here, people are seen as more mindful when you hear what they have to say than when you read it. Interestingly, in this study, we get the same effects in cases of agreement as well. So we're a little less clear what's going on in cases of agreement, but we generally find across experiments a pretty strong tendency to view people as just being more mindful, have more stuff going on between their ears when you hear what they are, when you actually hear what's on their mind. I think this raises a couple of interesting questions for us that we're testing in lots of different ways in a variety of different experiments, and I just want to throw these out to get some conversation going, and obviously I'm not going anywhere, so we can talk about this as the day goes on. So the first really fundamental question is this one. Modern technology creates lots of different ways that we can interact with each other. This is a social psychological variable. It's a powerful situational context. And does the nature or does the way that we interact with each other affect the kinds of inferences that we make about each other? And this is really the question I'm most interested in. Are text-based interactions subtly dehumanizing in some way? They have a harder time conveying the presence of mind when you read just purely the semantic content that somebody is passing along compared to when you hear what they have to say. Modern life, of course, is making text-based kinds of interactions increasingly more common. I will say that we find similar results in domains that don't have to do with political disagreement, where you're just forming an impression of somebody else. They seem more mindful when you hear what's on their mind than when you read the same kind of context. So in one of our experiments, we had MBA students at the University of Chicago give elevator pitches. If you're not a recent MBA student, you might forget what these are, but the idea is that an elevator pitch is a 2 to 3 minute presentation where me, Mr. or Mrs. Job Candidate, get to explain to you why I'm exactly the right person for your company to hire. Okay? So we have our MBA students give elevator pitches. Again, we get the same 4 conditions from them as I described to you a moment ago. We record them over a video camera, and we present these to observers who judge how thoughtful, how intelligent, how rational, how reasonable the person is. They indicate how much they like the person, overall impression measure, and then they report how interested they would be in hiring the person for a job. And we find both among just natural observers, just adults who are not hiring people for a living, we find a tendency to judge our MBA students more favorably, more thoughtful, more intelligent, more rational, more interested in hiring them when you hear the elevator pitch than when you read it. We also find this among a sample of Fortune 500 HR managers who conduct interviews for a living that we recruited through a conference that I was speaking at. We find exactly the same effects among them as well. In other studies with first impressions, we have people just share a story, a memory from their lives, a positive experience that they had or a negative experience, a decision that turned out well or a decision that turned out poorly. And you just watch the person explain this memory to you, sort of just a little first impression kind of study. We see the same kinds of effects there as well. Again, a person seems more mindful, more thoughtful, more intelligent, more rational, more human-like when you hear what they have to say than when you read the same context. Second question that's of interest, I think, is the inverse of this. If stripping voice out of human interaction makes other people seem a little bit less mindful, what about adding human voice into non-human agents? Can you humanize technology by giving it a voice? And so this is really a question about anthropomorphism. And we've studied this in a few different ways. One reaches back to the talk we just heard of a moment ago with autonomous vehicles. So we had a grant from General Motors a few years ago where we put people in a driving simulator and we set it up as an autonomous vehicle or just a regular driving vehicle. And what we did was we enabled people to anthropomorphize the autonomous vehicle. And we did so in sort of a noisy way in these experiments. We gave it a voice is what we did. The voice also has other features to it as well, so the car would talk to you. A little like Kit, but a little more sophisticated. So this was a real human voice. This was Heather Caruso, who's on our faculty at the University of Chicago. She turns out to be an amazing GPS lady. And the car would communicate with you. You would hear it as you were driving. Now the voice also includes gender, and the car would be responsive. It would note things that were going on around it. But what we found was that adding language with a voice to the technology here increased the attribution of mind to it. That is, it increased anthropomorphism, more likely to judge the car as better able to sense what was going around it, better able to plan a route, more capable of driving you across town, for instance, doing what it needed to do. Giving it a mind made it seem more competent, as we see with judgments of people too. It increased people's reported trust in the vehicle. So they reported being more confident that it could drive you safely through a route after you had anthropomorphized it. It also made people feel more relaxed while we were driving this, and we got this from heart monitors. People were calmer as they were driving the vehicle that was anthropomorphized than the other. And it also affected judgments of blame for an accident that the vehicle got into. Now, I should say this was a rather unique circumstances. For experimental reasons, we had to make sure that everybody got into an accident. We were interested in how they responded in an accident. And the way we had to set that up is they were sideswiped by another car. So somebody in another car hit their vehicle. And what we found is that people in the anthropomorphism condition, where the car had a voice in it, they were more likely to blame the other car. They rated, so judgments of intelligence were actually negatively correlated with blame for their car there. They were more likely to blame the other one. If your car gets into an accident on its own, that's a different story. Here they were hit by somebody else. Juliana and I find in other work that if you take computer-generated speech and you add voice to it, you have somebody read it, and you know that somebody is reading the speech, you're more likely to guess that it was actually created by a human being than by a computer algorithm. Here we use the postmodernist essay generator as our stimuli for this, which is hilarious to read a few of. And the last question is this one. I think this is really a fundamental question for anybody who's thinking about technology, and that is, do we know how to use this well? That is, are we tech savvy as users? Do we understand how the medium of interaction affects the message we get and the impressions that we form of each other? And in lots of ways, we're finding that people don't seem to be so media savvy. Perhaps they pick it up over time. That could be. But these effects are much more subtle for people who are in the midst of experiencing them than they might be when we're thinking about them broadly. So consider this. This was an old study that we did some years ago with Justin Kruger as a colleague and longtime friend of mine, where we had people communicating sincere and sarcastic messages, either over email, they were typing to the other person, or over voice, they were talking to the other person over a telephone. Now, of course, everybody in this room knows that sincerity and sarcasm is communicated not just by what you say, but how you say it. And so we'd expect people to be more accurate interpreting speech when you hear it than when you read it, and of course they were. So this is the percentage of statements that were coded correctly. What we had participants do here was generate 20 statements, 10 of which were intended to be sincere, 10 of which were intended to be sarcastic. They sent them off to a recipient. Recipients judged whether that was sincere, meant to be sincere or sarcastic, and you can see that they judge it more accurately when they hear what the person has to say than when they read what the person has to say. In this case, over email, accuracy rates were no higher than chance, not statistically higher than chance. We didn't allow them to use emoticons here. But that's not the interesting question. We kind of all intuitively understand that. The question is, are we media savvy? That is, do we understand how the message we're communicating is affected by the context in which we're communicating it? So we had the senders predict how many the recipients would interpret correctly. And here what you can see is that the senders' predictions were totally insensitive to how the medium was affecting the message that they were communicating. You knew what you were communicating. It was clear to you. And so you assumed to be relatively clear to others. We also asked the recipients to tell us how many of these 20 they decoded accurately or they decoded correctly. And what you can see here, that's the percentage that they thought they were interpreting correctly. And you can see that they also don't seem to have any sense of how the medium was affected, the message they were communicating. And of course, this over here, this column here tells you everything that's wrong with modern communication. People communicating a chance, being sure they're communicating clearly, and being absolutely certain that they're hearing it clearly. In another study, we asked people related to elevator pitches. We asked them in the context of elevator pitches, this was a big survey we conducted online, if you wanted to be perceived as most intelligent giving this elevator pitch, how would you choose to express your thoughts to someone? Overwhelmingly, people said they would prefer to write than they would to talk, even though in our data we find exactly the opposite effects. Okay? I want to end with a quote not from somebody engaged in work with modern technology, but rather from somebody engaged with old school technology. So this is a comment from Helen Keller, which I think speaks to the important kind of fundamental psychological principles that are at work here. These phenomena that I'm talking about here aren't just the phenomena about modern technology. How we interact with each other and the cues that we use. Can I hear what somebody has to say? Are we using voice? Am I just seeing somebody? Are we just using the semantic content? Is an age-old issue. Helen Keller once wrote a letter back to a friend who had invited her to speak at a conference advocating for rights for deaf children. She wasn't able to make the conference. And she wrote a response letter expressing her sadness that she couldn't make the conference, and this is what she said. She said, "I'm just as deaf as I am blind. The problems of deafness are deeper and more complex, if not more important than those of blindness. Deafness is a much worse misfortune, for it means the loss of the most vital stimulus, the sound of the voice that brings language, sets thoughts astir, and keeps us in the intellectual company of man." More heartbreaking moment, though, came later in the letter when she was expressing experiences that she had seen of parents with deaf children. She wrote, "I've received letters from the parents of children who were either deaf or feeble-minded. The parents could not say which. The doctor did not know, or else he did not tell them the truth. Now, we rarely talk about people as being feeble-minded these days, but I think the phenomena of people who lack a voice, if you can't hear what they have to say, seeming less intelligent, I think is every bit as real today as it was for Helen Keller. Thanks all for your time. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you brought up Helen Keller. The question I had was specifically about this. I don't know what the applied value of this would be, but did you ever consider having one of your conditions be one in which you had the visual feedback only? So you told the participant, I'm very sorry, but the audio is not working.
Yep.
You get to watch the video,
Yep,
and here's the text. Where did that fit in?
It tends to look exactly like the text. So if what we do is we have subtitled video, it tends to look exactly like the text. Because people read it. And what we find, so I should have said this in more detail, the reason why voice conveys mind, so really what you're doing here is you're making a judgment about whether somebody's got stuff going on in here or whether they're kind of dead inside. And the voice contains cues to mental life. I mean, if you look around, how can you tell that somebody is biologically alive? Well, they move, right? If you're laying down on the ground, not moving, either you're sleeping or you're dead, but you're not active. I can tell that you're alive because you move, you're responsive, you blink and so on. The voice moves too. So the voice has intonation, it goes up and down. It speeds up and slows down. And what we find is that those paralinguistic cues to sort of motion, to kind of intellectual motion we can think of it as, that's what communicates the presence of mind. If you strip that out, if we have people just read statements or have people talk as if they're not having the actual thoughts that are communicated in the text, they get monotone. Monotone sounds mindless. And so when people read the text, they don't impute the same paralinguistic cues that communicate mental life that a real speaker actually puts into it.
Is there a possibility that because they're reading, they're not able to pay attention to the visual cues because their eyes are directed at the text?
That could be.
I'm sure it would still.
That could be. It's a very hard thing when you run these medium conditions to get all of those cues exactly right. We do the best we can. That's what we did. We don't, well, look, in some cases you do. Certainly they affect your inferences, but the presence of mind, we don't find that. I mean, the body's not as connected to your mind. It's not as expressive about your mind as your voice is, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, just some observations. Your question was, are people media savvy? Well, when people are given choices about what medium they want to use, they often make decisions which would lead them to be less mindful. So there have been experiments on media choice, for example, where people, rather than electing to use voice, people preferentially use text.
Yes.
So that's one instance. Another is with...
But are you suggesting that makes them media savvy or not?
No, I'm saying the opposite. People behave in ways that...
Yes.
That
we have other experiments like that too. We have one, my favorite is where we ask people to reconnect with an old friend, either over voice or over email. And they say they'll feel more connected if they talk than if they type, but that'll be more awkward to talk than to type. And so 2/3 of them prefer to type than to talk. And it turns out they're wrong about that they actually feel more connected when they talk than when they type, but it's no more awkward. And so they make a mistake in that case.
Yeah, and then there are mistakes which are the other way, which are, you say there are no effects for video over...
On these DVs, yes.
Yes, and in fact, people prefer video conferencing. If they're given the choice, people prefer Skype over phone.
Yeah.
So again, that suggests
I think so.
that people aren't media savvy. I just had one other question. So these are all asynchronous presentations of media. What about interactivity?
Yeah.
So the question would be, if you're texting with someone incrementally, are they more mindful than maybe hearing their voicemail message?
Yeah, so that's a hard thing for us to study experimentally. We've tried one experiment like that where people were talking about an issue that they disagreed or agreed with another person on, trigger warnings on campus. The issue we found there is that people didn't really have much to base up, but to support their beliefs, so when they were talking to each other, they didn't really have anything to say. So that didn't work out very, very well. They sounded kind of dumb because they had nothing to talk about. But we haven't started to do that in a very serious way. That adds a lot of complexity to the content in the interaction. All of these studies, we hold the semantic context exactly constant for purity purposes for experiments, but we definitely need to go there next. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. I think you began to touch on this earlier. I think different people have different nonverbal communication styles, and I think it's possible to measure this. Have you guys, or has there been any research measuring difference between nonverbal communication styles in people's perceptions of mindfulness? Or
not that I know of on these kinds of measures. Not that I know of. What we would expect is that people who look more lively would be judged as more mentally lively as well. I don't think the cues are radically different. So if you're an outgoing extroverted person who moves a lot, you seem more thoughtful, I would guess, in general, than if you don't move much at all. But I hope that's true, because I'm a pretty outgoing extroverted person. Yeah.
So I had a couple of questions. One is that when someone is choosing between written communication and spoken communication, they're not going to choose to use exactly the same words. They will write in such a way that the emphasis and the emotion and whatever is conveyed by the structure of the sentences.
Not true.
And so if you strip away, the sound from speech and just leave the text, you're not getting the same text
Right. So we have two
that
text
someone
conditions.
would choose to write.
We have two text conditions. Maybe I made this wasn't clear enough. So we have two text conditions. One in which you take the transcript from the spoken communication, and the other where people write. So in the presidential election study that I showed you, in the primary study, and in the elevator pitch studies, there we've got two text conditions. One where we take the transcript, and the other where they write explicitly. And we do that for precisely this reason, because obviously the content can vary and you use different stuff. Yeah, so we do that, and we find those two are identical, that the thing that varies, the thing that's important, is the presence or absence of voice, not whether it's the intended medium, like whether you're writing for somebody to read it. So yeah, we've considered that carefully.
And then the second question is that in the early days of video conferencing, there were a lot of studies on what aspects of video conferencing would make it productive as a face-to-face meeting. And my recollection is people found that having direct eye contact, which requires clever optics in the video conferencing system, produced a condition where you could match the productivity of face-to-face. And otherwise, so even if you had vision, of course you have speech in all the conditions, you didn't get the productivity. So, but your results would suggest that voice is pretty much sufficient.
So it's important to remember what we're measuring. We're measuring judgments of how intelligent or thoughtful or rational you are, not how well you coordinate conversation with other people, right? So obviously, visual information is critical for lots of stuff, and we use it for lots of things, like coordinating with other people. So if I see somebody looking at me, I know they're interested in talking to me. If I can see you're trying to speak, I know that it's your turn. So I think the only difference here is that's a very different kind of dependent variable. We're not suggesting that voice is essential for everything, but for understanding the mind of another person or recognizing the other mind
in
of
a sort of a
person's
one-way communication setting, I guess is what you would say.
Well, I would still expect the same effects on these DVs, which are judgments about the capacity of another person's mind when you could see them or hear them or read what they have to say. But what you're talking about with video conferencing is the dependent measure is about coordination. How well can I coordinate? Right. Do I know when to speak?
But it's a two-way communication, right? So
that's right.
You're measuring someone's mind perhaps in a two-way setting as opposed to a one-way setting.
Lots of things that are different about that context that we don't measure here. So I don't want to overstate or have you walk away with interpretation that our results say more than they do. These are judgments about what do you have going on between your ears when I can hear you or not.